course.
Regardless of what we do with that, it's good to have. Okay. So this specific project, what was the idea for this? What was the beginning of this? What makes you want to do it? What's the plan, you know?
I think the plan for this is, or kind of the idea that was behind it was, my collaborator and I were just kind of like having like a conversation one day, and then we were just like, oh, hey, what if we had like this really like wacky, insane kind of like character who is very representative of kind of like the villain archetype that a lot of people are familiar with. So like something that you would see in like Despicable Me, Megamind, like incredibly like convoluted in terms of bringing their plans to fruition. And it's like, well, what if he had like an assistant or something, like an unpaid intern who just doesn't want to be there? And we always had the idea kind of like in our heads, and it wasn't until like very, very recently, because we always wanted to turn it into like something more than that. And we weren't sure if we wanted to make it into like a book or like to some kind of like script format. And the more I got into screenwriting, I kind of realized that this might be like the project to really kind of like start out that path. And this is like the thing that I've like probably put in the most effort in terms of just like trying to think about how to write characters and how to write stories in a screenplay format rather than something that's like a novel or in prose and everything, because the two of them are completely different mediums and completely different like wheelhouses. And so it's definitely taken a second to kind of like step back and kind of like reorient my process to kind of fit with this new medium.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, like especially I didn't realize how different the two were, because I'd never really written prose until I started talking to people who write prose, and then I was like, oh, wait a second, this is like a completely different mental process. And for what it's worth, it seems like you very much have it down. Like the characters, like with me, your writing style does not indicate someone who's hung up on prose thinking. You seem like fully in screenplay mode here.
I'd say, yeah, I'd say so. It's been like a bit of a challenge, but nothing that's been like too overwhelming, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And then as for this specific, we're just focusing on this season. What do you think is lacking in terms of the story itself? Like what areas do you feel that this needs help in?
I'd say probably, I don't know, I'm not sure if I'd use the word lacking, but I feel like I have a very clear picture of what like the first like couple of episodes are, and that's just because I've been thinking about them so much and like filling in kind of like all the details and everything. I think my goal in terms of like the overarching plot of the season is trying to see how I can uh, still have tension between the two characters in terms of the main conflict, because the whole season, kind of like the crux of it, is very dependent on the two characters and their relationship. And I don't want it to be the sense of kind of like, oh, you have two characters who like have their differences, but they're able to put those aside and work together, and then everything's solved. But then if everything's solved, and if that tension is kind of the crux of the season, that's something that you can't really solve in like one episode, or that's something that kind of I want to be kind of resolved at the very end of the season. And so I think for me, it's kind of like, how do I have or show these two characters kind of working together, but still have like there be a gradual progression in terms of them being able to kind of trust each other and like work together in the way that they can be the most successful at what they're trying to do.
Right. And I definitely clocked that pretty quickly. That was just like, okay, the end of episode 1 is like, oh, we're going to be a dynamic duo now. And then that's like, roll credits. I guess, I mean, there are certainly areas where you can see that they would clash just looking at your season outline, especially at the end there when, Mel is under the impression that Faye has betrayed him, but it turns out that, Faye is working against Roderick and stuff like that. But that, I guess, isn't really what you're going for. You want actual character issues between them, stuff that isn't. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I suppose what do they have to disagree about would be my first question in that department. Like, really, what are they going to fight about? Because they certainly need each other, right? Faye needs him because it's a job and it's work, and also there's some underlying sense of like she wants chaos, she wants that sort of lifestyle, and Mel just needs her because he needs help. But then outside of that, I guess there's a lot of room for them to butt heads. How do you feel about that?
I'd be down for that, honestly, because like I like the idea that as they're working together, as they're working together on like the individual missions, there are still things that they will like continue to kind of like clash about, and not everything is always working very smoothly. So like when it comes to someone like Mel, you're working with someone who's like very, very spontaneous, who like has all of these like incredibly like on surface level they sound like incredibly just like stupid ideas. And ultimately he's working in kind of like under like a different mindset than Faye is. Faye is definitely a lot more realistic in the way that she kind of like processes situations. She's like fairly a lot more kind of like grounded. And I think the two of them just like clashing on just like a collaborative level. You have Mel on one hand who isn't used to working with other people before, and that's one of the reasons why he's so hesitant to like hire a nemesis in the first place, because he knows that he needs it. He knows that there's no way that he's going to be successful at what he wants to do unless he has one. But it's also the sense of like that means having to like listen to someone else and like have someone give him like a second opinion that he's always like not the most eager to listen to. Also the sense,
yeah, that makes sense.
Also another thing I think would be also interesting is Mel is not very great at communicating information, and even when he does, he might do it in a way that doesn't make the information clear. So in the first episode, like at the very end, when like Faye is like, hey, so like I'm getting paid for this job, right? Like I need to make sure that like I have bills to pay and everything. And Mel just kind of like waves it off and hands her this note. And it's mostly just superfluous, like kind of scribbles, but there is actual information on that card that is important. On the card is an address of an apartment that is reserved specifically for Faye to live in if she isn't able to pay like rent and everything. So like essentially being able to like take care of her if a scenario comes where they aren't able to, or she isn't able to make the income she needs to sustain herself. But because it's put in this note in an incredibly like convoluted way, Faye just like thinks, oh, this is just like a joke, and kind of rolls her eyes at it. And it comes to a head when like eventually, because the two of them throughout the episodes, they don't really make any money or are able to succeed at the point where they are making money. And so Faye does get evicted from her apartment, and then she has literally like nowhere else to really crash. And when she finally confronts Mel about it, which also Faye is not someone who is open to kind of like sharing things about herself. She isn't the type of person to talk about like her vulnerabilities and stuff, even when it's necessary sometimes to share that information. So like when she then like snaps at him, there's like a very much like a disagreement of like, oh, you always had the information, but yeah, that's probably not putting that in the best terms, I guess. But
yeah, I hear that. I think for that plot beat, and that plot beat is in episode 7, right?
yes, that is correct.
Yes. So she gets evicted at the beginning of 7, and that argument happens towards the end of 7, if I remember correctly.
Yes, I believe so. I think she gets evicted at the end of 6, and then the argument
Yes. Okay.
episode 7 starts with her not having anywhere to live.
Yes. Okay. I guess to me, I don't know, that note thing, it is a bit iffy, even though I understand, I think, what you're trying to communicate with it. I don't know, something about that feels, I think it could be workshopped a little better into something, because for Faye to literally just not read the note, does she not read the note? Like, does she literally just ignore the note?
I think she reads the note, but she kind of like rolls her eyes at it, because like for anyone reading the note, they probably would not be paying attention to like the little address that happens to be there.
Well,
I think you're
yeah,
right.
yeah.
This could be done in a more like smooth or a more efficient way, I think.
Well, I don't think it's just that. I think you could introduce a little more character depth with it, because I mean, you're making a point about Mel and Mel's inability to communicate, which is fine, but there's no like deeper emotional levels to this the way you have it now. I mean, imagine if you made this more about Faye and Faye's inability to accept good things that happen to her. Like, it's always got to be conflict. It can never be peace. So when something is offered her that seems too good to be true, she she thinks it's a joke and she doesn't take it seriously. And I think that this is more of a Faye beat fundamentally. Like, this doesn't feel like yeah, it's a gag about, you know, Mel's bad handwriting or whatever. But more than that, it's like, oh, I'm giving you something for free, like no strings attached. This is for you. I'm being kind. And of course, she can't accept that in her head because she's so chaos, conflict oriented, you know? But that's the way I see it.
That is actually no, that's a much better way of thinking about it.
And then you turn it into a conversation about Faye's inability to, you know, to kind of settle down and to just embrace peace. And that's her character. I mean, that's the first thing we learn about her character, is that she's not okay with monotony and peace. She wants conflict, she wants chaos, she wants excitement. And in a certain sense, somebody offering her stability is not what she wants subconsciously. And I would honestly use the homeless arc, I would use that bit of time to kind of show that she's not just, you know, chilling out, sleeping under a bridge. Maybe on some level she's enjoying herself. Maybe she's going on these, like, you know, these kind of carefree adventures, and sort of she's like, she wants to be at the bottom so that she can, you know, have an excuse to steal and to get into conflicts and to claw her way up. That's part of the appeal of it to her. And so instead of just having her, like, you know, well, if I got nowhere to stay, it could be like, no, I'm not gonna, acting like she doesn't like it. uh, I guess you could just say a lot about her with that bit, you know.
Well, I like the idea that you bring up about her who isn't able to accept stability or isn't able to accept kindness, because I know that between the two of them, in terms of like the two of them trusting each other, I know that or Mel trusts Faye a lot sooner before Faye is able to fully trust Mel. And I think when it comes to Faye, like I think that definitely plays into like a larger conflict with her character, because the entire later half of the season is very much focused on, it's a lot more focused on Faye, and it's also more focused on the possibility of like her like betraying him to Roderick, or like her constantly
Yes.
thinking about like all of the reasons why she should like leave, despite the fact that like in reality this is the best job that she's ever had.
Yeah, no, it's sort of, it's a reluctance to settle down. I think that's like the first thing that I see with her character, is just like, it's like, I can't accept that things are going well. I think there's a little bit of paranoia there, and it's a flaw that I think she has to overcome, and that's the point she gets to by the end of the season, right? It's, you know, she learns to be okay with Mel. And I guess we can talk about Mel's arc throughout the series too. What do you, just to switch gears to that, what do you see as Mel's trajectory, like emotionally? What does Mel starts one way and ends what way? How would you describe Mel's arc?
I would say that Mel like kind of starts out very much like he knows exactly what he wants to be. He knows kind of like the path. Like he knows he wants to be this very successful supervillain, and he knows at the beginning of the season that despite like the whole act, he knows that he's not. And very much everything that he is doing throughout the season is trying to get there, but also trying to get kind of like the respect of kind of the people around him also. So I remember, or the first half of the season, he's just trying to get noticed by one of these larger kind of villain corporations. And then finally, when they do, they end up like turning him down. And is like, okay, well, I'm gonna still like next plan, I'm going to make a invention to present at VillainCon, so then I can be able to kind of like get attention and I can be like my big break. And then eventually when things kind of go down at VillainCon and him and Faye end up kind of like saving kind of like everyone from her hijacking the invention. That's kind of like the first point when like all of these like big supervillains are kind of like looking at him and are like, hey, you're actually seem to like know what you're doing. Would you like to be a part of us? And I think through kind of like seeing the other supervillains in this kind of world, and like kind of like whether it be like the way that they treat their henchmen, or like also the different types of success, because the story ultimately like it boils down to like success and relationships between other people. And I think Mel at the beginning of the series, Mel kind of he wants to be successful, but he doesn't really know what that idea of success is. It's not like a tangible thing. It's just kind of like this idea that is in his head that he knows that he wants to meet. And so throughout the season, he constantly, or in a lot of the episodes, he's interacting with people who have achieved some kind of success. Like Roderick works for one of these like incredibly like wealthy evil organizations. His ex literally sold, like was a sellout to become a really like wealthy and famous superhero. Even other characters too that he interacts with have all kind of become successful, and kind of like seeing these kind of like different people around him, he kind of realizes by the end of the season, specifically when he is kind of like asked like, hey, like join us, we would want you to be a part of this. He kind of realized that he doesn't need to seek their approval anymore.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I was picking up on all of that. It's very cool. I think, yeah, that works as an arc for Mel. I do have, this is probably the biggest question I have about the entire story in general, which is about the conception of heroes and villains and good and evil and what that all means in your story world. Because, like, are these villains like human trafficking? Are they like killing innocents? Like, are they doing actual evil things? Or is it just like the Despicable Me, Megamind, evil aesthetic? You know, it's like that SNL skit where The Rock plays like
Yes.
a villain at a villain con. You know what I'm talking about?
I made a robot that molests children,
Yeah, that.
and everyone
Like,
else
does
is
that
just
exist in your world? Is that the sort of tone that is that how people would react to these villains? Or are the villains like, is it all money? Is it like an organized crime syndicate that just soaks up money?
I think, and I this is probably going to sound like an incredibly dumb point of comparison, I guess, but I kind of realized it the more I kept on like working on the script. I feel like being a supervillain in this world, supervillain or like a superhero, in my head became more like allegorious with trying to be a film major, in
Okay.
terms of just like you have like these big giant corporations where you have villains who they have these corporations that can be able to fund them so they can be able to like do whatever the hell they want, and the people who then like don't have that kind of power are very much kind of like freelancing and struggling and like trying to get by while also trying to do what they want to do. um I'd say in terms of like the concept of good and evil, I think there's kind of a bit of a spectrum, because being a superhero or being a villain does not determine whether you are a good or bad person. It more kind of determines kind of like your job and your aesthetics and everything. But within that, like most of the heroes are mostly assholes, mostly like oblivious assholes, with the one exception of Metacomet, who is a character who kind of like calls out a lot of the hypocrisy in that kind of realm. But in terms of the supervillains, they range on just people who are just kind of like really fun and just like enjoy like doing their jobs, and people like similar to Roderick who are very much assholes and kind of carry a lot more malice with them. Like Mel is the case of like nothing, like he doesn't have like some kind of traumatic backstory where it's like, oh, I was traumatized and everyone hated me and I wanted to become a supervillain. Like he approaches being a supervillain as something, like he approaches that with like optimism and a lot of excitement. Whereas like you have a character like Faye who did have like an incredibly like very traumatic childhood, and if she had figured out or learned about this whole supervillain thing a lot like earlier in life, probably would have ended up like being someone like Roderick.
So what is what is the supervillain thing? What does it mean to be a supervillain in your universe?
I think it means just generally kind of like a desire to kind of like cause chaos, draw attention, kind of like sort of do what you want. Um, I think very much like even in Faye's first scene where you see her kind of like destroying like the coffee shop, kind of like just very much destroying kind of the established order and just like having a lot of fun while doing it, I would argue. Like less of like doing like bad things for the sake of doing bad things, but more of the sense of like doing that for attention and doing that for like fun and such.
Right. And I guess just for me, that becomes a little muddled when you bring in the idea of like evil corporations who sponsor these people and who I don't know. I guess if this movement is built on the backs of individuals who just kind of want to do pranks. I'm just going to call it pranks because that's what's happening. These very like aesthetically, um,
Aesthetically motivated pranks.
yeah, just aesthetically motivated pranks. Then what is the goal of the corporation? Do the corporations do they have the same sort of motivation, which is like, oh, we want to do pranks too, but we're going to all organize ourselves and make the biggest pranks ever? Or are the corporations exploiting the supervillains sense of like need for identity? Like, are the corporations like, hey, well, if you want to get a bunch of attention, then you can work for us and we'll sponsor your pranks as long as those pranks, benefit us. Like, you know what I mean by that? Like, as the
Yes.
hierarchy goes up, it becomes harder and harder to make this about individual attention seeking because that's just not what a corporation is.
Oh, absolutely. I
So how would you
think probably
describe the motivations of like PEA? What do they want? That faction.
I'd say sorry. I'd say probably when it comes to like the PEA, they are definitely or even in terms of like the larger evil organizations, um, they I think would be more on board with kind of like the whole like human trafficking and doing things that would actually harm people. Mel kind of has this very specific idea of what it means to be a supervillain in his own eyes, and the corporations kind of have an idea of what it means to be a supervillain in their type of eyes. Um, when it comes to the PEA, they're certainly a lot more kind of like, oh, we're going to like do all of these like giant, larger than life, like horrendous type crimes that everyone will know about and everyone will talk about. And that's all they're really able to do because that is able to make them like the most success. And someone like Mel eventually kind of recognizes, like, hey, if this is the only type of crime that's going on, you're reducing supervillainy to only be this kind of like one thing, I guess. And I would argue, yes, the organization, in terms of how it treats most of its henchmen, would be, yes, definitely, definitely in terms of on like the levels of like exploitative and such.
Right. Like I think like psychologically exploitative. Like you have these people who are very insecure. Like I think Mel, I just think this is a very insecure person. Um,
That checks
and
out.
so the corporation would latch onto that insecurity and the insecurities of people like Mel and use them for their own ends. But again, the problem that I have is that what exactly are the corporation's ends? Like what do they want? Like I think if it were me, I would just make them basically like the Chicago Mafia. I would make them like an organized crime syndicate in that sense. And because like I don't know what is evil corporation. Like I'm having a hard time understanding specifically what this faction wants. Why would they team up? Are they all just attention seekers? And if they are, then how could they have the self-awareness to exploit other attention seekers without ever turning that inward? Like there has to be a higher agenda, a higher level of intelligence with them, I think. And I'm not sure what that is. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I honestly, I think it's kind of funny because when I first, because I think I would first introduce like the PEA and like sort of like their whole deal, like have Mel and Faye like go undercover in episode 5, I think. Originally, I imagined that as being like a villain mob organization. And then I was like, oh, I can just switch it to being like one of the evil corporations. So I can probably, I'd be interested in like going back and like really rethinking that because I think of all the aspects of all of the things in the world, I think that's one of my more blind spots in terms of like knowing what they're built around and kind of what is their place in this world.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And again, to me, I see this as, I mean, you have these individuals like Mel who want attention, who want validation, who are deeply insecure about that sort of thing. And then you have this faction that manages people like Mel. So, I mean, what do you, if you're a corporation, what do you stand to gain from people like Mel? And the answer to that would be terrorism. You know, you have a person who's conducting large scale displays that create fear, you know, and you can use that fear to further an agenda. So if I were P and I wanted, for instance, my plan is P, it's always just money and power, right? They're that type of organization. They want money and power. And they say, okay, so I want, let's just say I want this particular bank to go belly up because that'll somehow influence my own ends. You know, I want this bank to basically like, I don't know the exact terminology, but you know, what happens to banks, like Great Depression style stuff. So what I do is I commission one of my quote unquote supervillains to create some scare that causes people to want to all withdraw their money at once, which then furthers my own ends. I guess if that makes sense. Just like you have to at some point create a utility for these individuals who are doing these big displays of prankery.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that would be definitely a good, like a fantastic use of the concept.
Right. And again, the moral dimension of it is, I mean, I guess if you're just saying villain is a cultural term that doesn't necessarily mean um, well, I mean, I guess another thing to play on could be the idea that maybe people like um, I'm just using this as an example because I don't actually believe it. But it's like emo kids using like satanic symbols, you know, but like
Yes.
let's say for instance Satan was real, which I don't think is true, but let's say he was. Um,
Theoretically, of course.
Theoretically, let's say that Satan were real and emo kids started using satanic symbols. And they're doing that for their own, you know, their own sort of cultural needs and their own identity needs. Um, but there is, in fact, a literal Satan, you know? So, in the same way, I would think that like these villains are like using the villain culture, the villain aesthetic, the villain persona as a means to, you know, find self fulfillment. But underneath all that, there is an actual villainous force that is using these people. At least that's just the way the dots would connect in my head.
No, that seems like a
Because
pretty
it,
natural
yeah,
conclusion,
and I
considering.
do find it strange that the way that Mel ultimately wins them over in the very end is by saving them. Like in some ways that I guess I have to kind of unpack that, but you know, the thing that wins them over in the end isn't some display of evil. It's literally just the fact that he saves their lives. And to me, I guess that demands some level of interrogation because I don't know if that's like a good choice in terms of it's like, all right, so say I'm this evil organization and Mel wants to be part of the evil organization. How does he prove himself to them?
I think,
And I guess it's just competence. That's what you said. It was just like, oh, he knows what he's doing, which I guess works, but I don't know. I'm just kind of considering the deeper layers that this could have.
I think the deeper layers, I think I definitely agree in terms of kind of when it comes to the entire community, it's definitely a bunch of people who are kind of seeking fulfillment via kind of like aesthetics and through like tomfoolery and everything. I think when it comes to, at least at the villain con, because that's when Mel would then be like saving kind of everyone, I think there's more of an aspect on community there as well. Because it's not just the corporations who happen to be at the thing, it's kind of like everyone. So every single villain that happens to be in this city is present for that. And I think on top of doing things for kind of like maniacal tomfoolery kind of purposes, there is also a level of kind of community within kind of the realm of like supervillains and such. In terms of just like they happen to have like a villain university, that they would have like a villain like con where they get to like showcase all of like their weapons and all of their like new schemes and everything. And I think it would probably be, I think it would say a lot as the kind of person Mel is, in the fact that the thing that would get him attention from kind of other supervillains isn't him destroying something, but in him kind of like saving everyone else and kind of like being able to like assist and protect their community and everything. Because their community in this world has taken like a few hits since the government and the superheroes kind of like teamed up and everything. They've had like multiple cases of like villains like getting captured and sent away and no one knows where they are, to the point where like the only real supervillains who are still in charge or still in the game are the ones who either have nemesises or the ones who work for these kind of big corporations. And so Mel, I think, is very much like prioritizes kind of like the whole his idea of what it means to be a villain, his idea of kind of like goofing around and everything, concocting all these schemes, but also at heart he is not a malicious person, and he is not the type of person who would kind of betray other people for the sake of his own needs.
Is that how he sees it?
Hmm?
Does he know? Does he know that? I mean, if you asked him, like, who do you see yourself as? Let's say in the pilot, what would he say?
The soon to be greatest supervillain of all time.
And what does that mean to him? Like, what does that mean?
I think
He's
that
going to
means
be the single biggest disruptor. He's going to be the ultimate.
at the
Yeah.
time,
No,
at the
yeah.
time, yes. Because that in his head is his idea of success. Or
Okay.
what his idea of success has been up until this point. And I think it'd also be interesting because like up until this point, he's never had anyone else to kind of like protect, or he's never had anyone else to kind of like think about other than himself. And so I would see kind of in working with Faye and in learning how to kind of be a better communicator and thinking a little bit more before he acts, that would kind of like, and also just like having like someone else like who's along with him. This is no longer just him that he is responsible for. That would probably be something that would change his perspective.
Change his perspective on what? Because he's changed his perspective on his need for community. Because on one hand, you're saying he wants to be a loner and he wants to do it all himself, but on the other hand, you're saying that he craves community, and he wants to be a part of the club. So which is it? How do you reconcile those two things?
I'd say at the beginning he's definitely a loner who craves community, but is very much afraid to ask for help. And by the end of it, he understands the kind of person that he wants to be and the kind of people that he wants to be around. So the people that he used to idolize, he no longer kind of idolizes. He doesn't really have anything to prove to them at this point. The people who matter already have their kind of opinion of him, and that's all that really counts. I hope that made sense-ish.
Yeah, no, I gotcha. Yeah. That makes sense. I think for me, I'm definitely just still hung up on the goals of the villains. I mean, they're a community, they're a social group. They, I guess, like, it's just hard for me to reconcile the idea that they're evil with the fact that they are so incredibly not evil. Like, but then you have, like, you know, the heroes who are sort of a brand, sort of with the government, sort of a, you know, they exist. I just, yeah, I guess I'm having trouble with the whole, like, what is a villain and why would they team up and why are they, and again, I don't think there's an easy tweak for all this. I think this is like a pretty deep structural thing in terms of these corporations. What do the corporations want? How do they interact with the villains? And then how high up does it go? Like, you know, are these the people that Mel wants to impress so badly? Are they in on it, or do they think the same way that he does? Are they like the popular clique at school? Is that their vibe? And if so, then there would have to be another level above them that actually does understand the ambitions of the organization.
I would actually be inclined to think, or in terms of how, like, supervillains and heroes, about like who is at the very, very, very top. I'm curious what it would mean if they were both somehow connected or tied to the same thing. Like someone kind of using superheroes and supervillains as concepts to kind of achieve their own ends and control the world.
Right. And I spoke to another writer, I mean, who had a script of a completely different nature. And it was something along the lines of that. Like, there was basically the commodification of the good versus evil narrative was ultimately a plot by the government to keep everybody sedated, you know, but those also aren't really your themes whatsoever. So
There.
I'd hesitate to incorporate something like that, because that just doesn't, like, that doesn't seem to be what your story is about. Like this other story I'm talking about, this was very much about you know, false division and black and white thinking, and you know, it was about heroes and villains coming together. Whereas for you, it seems to be the heroes are just a permanent fixture of the culture, and you're dealing with completely different ideas. So I understand, yeah, it does make sense to kind of unite them under one force like that.
But also at
But
the same time,
also,
this is more focused on, like, in terms of like heroes and villains, it's definitely more focused on the villains than it is the heroes. The heroes just kind of exist, or they're just kind of like around, I guess.
yeah. So I'd say, I wouldn't unite them under one singular banner of a single, you know, a plot like that. But I would say creating a purpose for the villains, other than just get pranked, lol. Like, creating some greater ambition that somebody is using them for. You know, the biggest villain, the actual villain at the very top of this, which I guess also factors into, like, say, like a confrontation between Mel and Roderick eventually. I mean, I guess they defeat Roderick at the end there. But at a certain point, like, if you look at stories like Megamind and Despicable Me, the whole point of it is that the villain eventually becomes
The hero.
a hero. Yeah. Except you're not doing that. You're just having these social dynamics occur within the villain faction, and you're never challenging the concept of villainry itself. So you're saying the villain isn't a negative thing. It's kind of just, it's sort of just this is aesthetically driven clique of people who have a shared identity, which is cool, which is a unique angle on it. But what does an antagonist, let's say like, a season 2 or 3 antagonist to these people look like? Imagine, like, could you have a hero antagonist to these two who is actually like, hey, you guys are doing really bad stuff and I want to stop you? Because there's a disconnect at a certain point where it's like, is there a reason to, oh yeah, it's weird, I don't know.
It's a bit messy when I start thinking about it more. I think it's probably, again, I think that's another blind spot that I'm gonna need to kind of like look over and really like think about, because of all in terms of the priorities, or just like all of the things that were at the top of my head. I think the concept of villainy in general probably should have been a lot higher. Or it's definitely something that I'm gonna need to like take some time to kind of like step back and think about. Another thing too, because like I also, season 1, I would ideally like this to be like maybe like go into a season 2 or a season 3, but I don't have any ideas for what that main conflict would be. Like I could come up with ideas for like episodes and everything, but I wouldn't want to do it if there wasn't a main conflict. And I think a natural escalation would probably be in order at some point. So like if Roderick works for one of these supervillain corporations, like eventually the two of them, Mel and Faith, facing someone who is like higher up the totem pole, who is kind of like more focused around that greater ambition, would probably be more of a natural progression. I think the main challenge then, or one of the main challenges, is just kind of figuring out who happens to be at the top and what would they want, and how would they be using this community to try to succeed their own goals, so to speak.
Right, and if it were me, I guess flaws at the end of this first season. And they see the issues in their thinking. They see that they were all, like Mel, he was very, very insecure and very appearance oriented. This is like Mel stepping outside of Plato's cave in a sense. This is like Mel seeing the light and being like, wait a second, like I was just all in this for appearances. Like what am I even doing here? Do I even care about this? And so Mel, I guess after this moment, I think he looks around and he says, wait, all of you guys are just thinking the way I was thinking. Like you're all just such superficial, like you're just doing this because you're not confident in yourselves. And then I guess that's where you introduce the character who wants that to be the status quo, who's exploiting that,
I'd say so, yeah. I think that would be an interesting angle to go at it, especially because then you're taking someone who has their idea of what it means to be kind of a supervillain, who isn't able to see any other perspective, which Mel now is able to provide.
Wait, could you say that again?
When you were talking before, you blurred, or you phased out a little bit for a second, but what I gathered is, for season 2, then there would probably be a focus of like you would have like Mel kind of like stepping out of a cave and kind of like seeing the error of his own ways and seeing how that happens to apply to everyone else. And then as he's trying to kind of like acknowledge that, you would have another character who's very deeply rooted in that mindset be the antagonist.
No. That's not what I was saying. I mean, you would have a character like that, but the real antagonist is not just past Mel. The real antagonist is the person who sees the utility in keeping all the villains insecure. Who wants, if I am like a person who wants to use these people for my own ends, then it is in my best interest to keep all of these villains so insecure and so appearance obsessed that I can just move them around to do my bidding. And so when Mel wakes up, that's going to trigger some alarm bells in this fictional villain that we're creating. This is
Yes.
going to be like, oh no, I don't like this guy because this guy is ruining the culture that I created, this culture of insecurity. That person themselves is not insecure.
I would actually be interested, rather than like exploring this in like a season 2, what if I had this be, or maybe implemented this in the later half of season 1? So like in episode 6, that's when Mel's brought in to the PEA, and basically all that happens is like the dude in charge is just like publicly just like rejects him and is like, oh, you're never gonna amount to anything. And what about that instead? Like he gives him, or he offers Mel the job. And then Mel has to kind of like take a step back with everything that he's kind of like learned so far up until now, and think to himself, or kind of realizing, and maybe even Faye could be someone to point it out, since she is a bit more level-headed at points. But that like corporations like these are very dependent on using other people's insecurities to kind of fund what they're doing.
But of course, Mel wouldn't see that until Mel undergoes his own growth.
That is fair.
So, I mean, that's the whole point of Mel. Mel doesn't know this yet. Mel craves the approval of these people because they've created a system that draws in people just like Mel. Like, that's the point. All of Mel's peers, all these other supervillains, they are all just deeply insecure people like him who are craving community and validation because the corporation has intentionally been messing with their heads and planting these ideas and manipulating them to accomplish their own ends, their own organized crime syndicate, where they can just play with these colorful characters and use them to influence society in the ways that they want. And then, of course, so you have that character. You have your manipulator, your power, your control character, your bigwig, and then you also have in season 2, perhaps you introduce a character who is like Mel was in the past, right? Like that's always a good way to do like if you have a character go on an arc and then you're like, oh, what do I do with the character after they complete their arc? Well, what you do is you have them reckon with kind of the sins of their past, sort of thing. So you bring in a character who is just like Mel was, and then Mel sort of has to confront a past version of himself and really examine those flaws and learn how to stop somebody else from making the same mistakes he did,
I think so.
Yeah. I don't know. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about with regard to like the world itself, or did you just want to get into the pilot and the screenplay and stuff?
Honestly, I'd be curious if there's anything else you would be interested in kind of like discussing, whether it be the pilot or any of the other story arcs throughout the season.
Okay. What does Vincent represent as Mel's ex? What is Vince? So Vincent betrayed the villains because he had information and he had knowledge and whatnot. So he betrays the villains. He becomes successful in his own way, which is free of it's not a sort of social success, it's like an actual power grab. Is that how you would describe Vincent?
I'd say so. I'd say Vincent is someone who's he's very much driven by also like his idea of success, and he very much does not, or is not opposed to throwing people under the bus in order to kind of have gained that success. I'd say, I think Vincent was probably the reason that this entire show kind of spawned, I guess, from just like a little idea into something more, just because I really liked the idea of his character and I really liked the idea of what he kind of brought to the table. Because I'd say Roderick and Vincent are the two examples of Mel's biggest fears when it comes to trusting Faye. Because Vincent was someone he used to be very, very close with, and also someone that like was his like basically his best friend and the person he was vulnerable with. And then as a result, despite the fact that they were friends, Vincent still betrayed him to basically become successful.
Yeah. And then, I mean, Roderick is just like the CEO of being a hater.
Pretty much.
How does Roderick emotionally, what does Roderick mean to Vincent?
To Vincent or Mel?
Oh, to Mel, yeah.
I'd say Roderick is very much an embodiment of everything that Mel isn't at this point in his life. Just in terms of, from his perspective, Mel sees Roderick as someone who is incredibly successful, and someone who has always kind of like belittled him and everything, in terms of like even since they were like at like college together and everything. And so another thing too is like Roderick is also someone who's just like generally just an asshole and a bad person, and a bit reflective of the kind of person that Faye could have been theoretically in a different life.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah. Because I mean, you see bits of that with Faye and Sky, because you said that Sky is basically when she reunites with Sky, she realizes kind of, or not quite realizes, but she gets a window into how her need for chaos hurts other people. Like, is that accurate?
I'd say less of her need for chaos and more of just the fact that it's kind of like having to face up for your mistakes. As Faye
Which were
is,
what specifically the mistakes? Which mistakes?
as she grew up, Faye was kind of basically just an asshole to everyone, including the one person who happened to be good, who happened to be just like a decent human being to her, which happened to be Sky, who was nothing but just like optimism and just very kind. And Faye kind of like like you kind of mentioned before, how she can't take kindness or she can't accept sincerity. Faye completely rejected that, and then like seeing and like to the point of just like verbal abuse and just being like generally an awful person. And then years later, Sky has now turned into someone who's like a bit more hardened. She still has like compassion and everything, she still like has like her kindness as like this trait, but she's had to kind of like work through a lot of insecurity since all of that happened.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so then when Faye sees her for the first time, she immediately realizes kind of like, oh shit, like my actions and like how I have treated this other person has fundamentally hurt someone. And like I am the bad guy in this scenario. And she ultimately like feels guilty but doesn't want to accept that guilt. And so as a result, then like in this like super villain club, I think they're at, she just kind of like, as Sky's like kind of standing up for herself, Faye just completely like snaps back and she goes into this kind of like asshole mode that we've never really seen her go into before, of just being someone who's just like basically harassing her to the point of like verbal abuse, and is going back into this complete bitch mode, all for the sake of self-defense, for her to like protect her from like having to face the guilt of the fact that she hurt someone else. And then the other supervillains kind of around are like, hey, you should leave. Or like, we don't like what you're saying here. We don't like the fact that you're harassing like our like one of our best performers. Leave. And then Faye's like, fine. And she turns around and then she sees Mel, who saw the entire thing. And in that moment earlier in the episode, like as he and Faye are going to this club, which he's really excited to go to because it's like, oh my God, this is like an actual like villain club and everything. I've always wanted to go to one of these, and finally I'm at a point where I've like done enough pranks that I kind of like have the cred, like the street cred to come in here. Roderick kind of confronts him at the front entrance, and basically it's kind of like a similar deal where Roderick is just like insulting him, and Mel's just kind of like, you know what, I'm gonna go in this club and I'm gonna have a good time. He goes in, yada yada yada. But so then when Faye turns around and like sees him, Mel is very much like he's taken aback for a bit because like this is like definitely something that reminds him of Roderick. And it gives him like seriously like bad vibes from someone who up until this point he was really growing to trust.
Okay. I guess the question I have then is it reasonable to draw kind of an emotional link between Mel and Roderick? Like what, I mean, not Mel and Roderick, between Faye and Roderick, because are they emotionally alike at all? Like, are we going to say that Roderick has the same sort of insecurities that Faye does? Or is it just the fact that they're both yelling? You know, because
I
right now,
I think so.
I mean, I understand that why Mel would see that. Mel would be like, oh, well, you're kind of mean and you're kind of mean. Oh, you're kind of reminding me of them. But like deep down, are they anything alike, Faye and Roderick?
Deep down I think so, because I think Roderick at multiple points, like throughout the, especially the later half of the season, Roderick is trying to convince Faye to kind of join his side. And Faye is always between the point of like about to listen and like, no, we're not going to listen. This dude's full of shit. Um, but I like the idea that she can't really walk away from the idea. I like the fact that Roderick kind of like sees and recognizes the fact that she is the reason why Mel is finally becoming successful, or it's the reason why all of his schemes are starting to work and he's actually starting to get like attention. And he himself, like emotionally, he feels very threatened by this because he cannot handle the fact of that someone that he would belittle and someone he's always looked down on could finally be more successful than him, or just even be able to kind of like stand up for himself. That's something that Broderick is genuinely unsettled by. And I think in
Okay.
terms of how he kind of views the world, I'd say the thing that he's probably the most terrified by is the idea that everyone, when brought to his level, everyone is can be or has the capacity to be just as horrible as him.
Okay. So why does Roderick look down on Mel in the first place? Because if you're going to draw a link between, I'm still not seeing the connection between Faye and Roderick, like in terms of like how they're alike. Um, are you saying then that Faye is the kind of person who just looks down on people for the sake of looking down on them? Because that's what you're implying when you connect them. But you've already explained that for Faye, it's more complicated than that. It's a need. She can't accept good news. She can't accept um, what's the word, authenticity, and she can't accept kindness. So that's what you're saying the core of Faye is. And that's why Faye's relationship with Sky didn't work out. And that's the origin of that fight. So again, I like, what does Roderick have to do with that other than being a dick? Because we know that he's like that. We know that he's just a bully. But what are his actual reasons for being a bully?
I would argue that the reasons or his reasons for being a bully is he sees power as a means of bringing someone else down to bring himself up. And I
And
think a lot of that,
does Faye do that? Is that what Faye does?
no, I need to think of some kind of emotional connection between the two, but it's not that.
Yeah, that's kind of just what I was, yeah, that's what I was getting at, was like they're both jerks, but in completely different ways. So for Mel to see that and be like, oh, you're kind of acting like Roderick. I mean, yes, but also on every level except superficial, not really.
Do you think, or what do you think that would work in terms of giving them an emotional connection? Because I know
I would just,
that's something
I
that
would
I
change
want
Roderick.
to do.
I would just make it so that Roderick um, has less of a superiority complex and actually has a deeper insecurity behind the way he is. Like if you want to say that Roderick is what Faye could have become, actually rewrite Roderick's backstory so that he is what Faye could have become. You know, like you have Faye who has a desire for um, who can't accept kindness and just has that sort of insecurity, can't accept sincerity. So if you take that to its extreme, um, that should be Roderick. That should be who Roderick is. Maybe he's evolved to hate kindness and sincerity so much that it's now his mission in life to wipe out kindness, because in his mind it's all fake, it's all manipulative, there's no good in the world. um, he's an extreme version of Faye's flaws.
I agree with that.
And I guess in terms of specific execution, I'm not sure how you'd pull that off, but I mean that would be the core of it.
Well, I know I have the two of them having a lot of interactions, especially later in the season, so I can probably be able to kind of like look over some things, kind of like reevaluate how I could be able to execute that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just having Roderick be a surface level Saturday morning antagonist, like there's nothing wrong with that at first, I think. Just this kind of, standard garden variety asshole. But then when you really start to dig into his psyche, you have to see why he is that way.
Especially because if he's going to be like the main antagonist at the end of the day, there needs to be something that packs a bit more of a punch.
Right. And I think there could be ways to tie him into Mel's arc emotionally too. Like, okay, imagine this. So the villains as a community, they're not really villainous. They have a sort of kindness between them, right? They have a sort of community. They have a sort of reciprocity. So somebody like Roderick would see that and
As
would not like it, right? Roderick would be like, no, this community, this kindness is fake. Um, this is like, you're not real villains. Look at you all. You're all just so like nice. Like, you know what I mean? He's like villain squared. He's like, he thinks the villains aren't villainous enough. He thinks that they're and he could honestly see through their insecurities. He could be like, look at you. You don't want to like commit evil acts. You just want friends, like you're pathetic. Like, you just need each other. You're so needy and you're so dependent on each other for validation. Well, I don't need that. I don't need validation. I'm my own thing. And I look down on all of you because I see you as weaker than me, because you are dependent on each other emotionally. Look at you with your conventions and your goofy shows that you put on together. Like you really think that you're, powerful people. You're nothing.
I do
And
not
then
need anyone. I do
what's
not
up?
need anyone, and because, or no, just to feed into that, like I do not need anyone. Look at all of your sense of community. Meanwhile, I'm by myself and I'm completely strong, and that goes completely against, or that goes against Mel, who throughout the season realizes that he needs community and he needs someone else in order for him to be successful.
And then you kind of run into another contradiction there, because Mel does want community the whole time. That's why he wants to be approved by the club. Ooh, okay, so then you're in a weird spot too, because if the villain community is actually a community where people are kind to each other, then the revelation then why shouldn't Mel? Then why is it a problem that Mel wants to be one of them? You know, it's not, because if they're all nice to each other, then Mel would just want to be like, you know, there would be no reason for Mel to see the error of their ways and fall back on Faye, like, you know, and become friends with Faye. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So you're in weird territory there too, because on one hand, if you make the villains into a more amicable group just for the sake of making Roderick worse, then you're undercutting Mel's arc, because Mel needs to see that the villains are all fake pieces of shit and they're all just like, you know, clamoring for attention. That's what Mel needs to see. And if they aren't that, then Mel's arc doesn't pack a punch anymore. But if they are that, then you're going to have to change Roderick a little more. Roderick is going to have to be almost an anti-hero who wants to expose the fakeness of the villains.
I think of everything, I would probably be most on board with changing Roderick. Just because I feel like compared to like Mel's arc and what I have for the villains so far, I feel like Roderick is the one who could use the most change, whether it be in his perspective or his role as an antagonist.
So if Roderick's goal is to destroy this villain league, Roderick wants to destroy the villain community because he looks down on them, then it would stand to reason that Roderick kind of offers an olive branch to Mel. Like, why would you want to be one of them? Like, why are you clamoring for their attention? They're worthless. Like, they're just, you know. And Mel's like, no, you don't understand. Once I'm one of them, it'll be a better, you know. So in a way, Roderick is spiteful, but he kind of sees the truth about the villain community. He just goes about processing that truth. His reaction to that truth is, oh, so I should, like, you know, I should actively make their lives worse because I look down on them. But like, he kind of has a point, you know. Like, and he kind of tells Mel, like, look how fake they are. Like, really, you want to be part of a villain club? You want, you know, why do you need their approval? That's what he would say to Mel.
I think that would work. I think that would work pretty well. I want to do, I'm gonna have to do a lot of like rethinking and reworking and such, just on how I want his character to think and act. But I think it would be interesting if he was the person who was able to see a truth that Mel is still figuring out. And I think it would probably be valuable then to have Mel recognize that truth while also kind of like seeing the benefits to the community.
Right, because if Roderick is just an extreme, like he's like, oh, this community is phony, so I just want to burn it all down, then Mel can sort of meet him in the middle and be like, well, this community is phony, but also it seems to be built on, you know, we can make it better, that sort of thing. Like, we can, and of course that aligns with the idea that there is another antagonist who comes out of the woodwork, because when Mel wakes up, you know, when Mel comes out of the cave like this, then obviously there's going to be reason for somebody else to have a problem with that. But also, I mean, Roderick's been out of the cave the whole time, so yeah, I don't know.
Do you think it would add anything if Roderick has been out of the cave, but he's not entirely like self-aware about it?
So do you think maybe Roderick isn't preaching about how the villains are all phony and how the corporation is using them? He doesn't think about it in that way. All he thinks is,
I think Roderick could be someone who's preaching like all of these villains are kind of like phonies. We're just using them while simultaneously he is also a villain being used.
Right. That makes sense. Like if
Like in his own head, he's too like high and mighty to be manipulated by anyone. Well, meanwhile, he happens to work for one of the biggest corporations that their whole deal is latching on to villains' insecurities in order to manipulate them.
right, that makes sense. I do like that a lot actually. Just the idea that he thinks that he's above it all, but in a sense he's not. So you can't make him too lucid. You know, you can't make him too aware of the manipulation. He has to see it in a way that doesn't implicate himself. He has to see it in a way that like maybe maybe he doesn't see the manipulation, he's against the sense of community, you know? So he sees that they're insecure and that they crave each other's attention, but he misses the bigger picture of, oh, the corporation is using that, you know? So the corporation is using their need for community, and in turn, the corporation is also using Roderick's own need for, um, what is Roderick's flaw? What's the hole in his identity that this solves for him?
I think maybe the hole in his identity, now that we're kind of, or we kind of mentioned the corporations, what if the corporation is key to his identity as well? If like that is like a key part of like how he views himself.
Right. So he thinks he's some kind of lone wolf, but that's just the idea that the corporation is planting in his head.
And then meanwhile you'd have him then be like very much like against, or maybe not even like against Mel, but very much kind of like finding it kind of funny of someone who isn't able to be in this community that he hates, but someone who's like far less successful at it than he is.
I mean, that's why he's not in the community, right? It's because he's not successful.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, Roderick is like, why would you want to be one of them when you could be a
You could also have Roderick kind of like hate Mel out of a sense of like self-loathing. Like if Roderick is all of the things that Mel isn't in terms of success, wouldn't it be feasible if Roderick kind of like hated Mel for that very reason? Because he would remind him of himself as like a less successful version.
well, I mean, there's no reason for Roderick to be jealous of Mel in any way. You know, there's no like I see why Roderick would look down on Mel, but I don't see any reason for Roderick to be like, because I mean Mel and Roderick don't have the same goals, at least on paper. Yeah, this would be worth just like writing this all down and kind of creating some kind of flow chart about it. Um,
I've been doing a little shorthand writing down while we've been talking and such. But it's definitely a fair amount of stuff that needs to be kind of worked through, just in terms of like where the characters stand and why exactly what their goal is in terms of the reason why they think the way they do.
yeah, I think Mel and Faye, your two protagonists, I think they both are in a really good place. Um, I just think how Roderick fits into that specifically is kind of a problem. Um, just that you'd need to work out, kind of just hammer out the dents there. Um,
I think it would be kind of fun though. I think that's figuring out how he kind of works and functions between the two characters, the story, and the world is something I think that would be really rewarding.
yeah, for sure. Because I mean, you have Mel and Faye, and they both work great. So the two main entities that you're having issues with are the corporation and their ambitions, and then Roderick. And so how the corporation and Roderick mesh together and how they mesh together with Mel and Faye. That's I think where your problems are mostly. Yeah.
Well, it's some pretty good problems to have.
Yeah, and I think your two protagonists are in a good spot. It's just like, I guess the question is also, is Roderick, because it'd be cool if Roderick could somehow represent problems for both of these characters. Like Robert, he means something to Mel and he means something to Faye. And I guess then the question is, are Mel and Faye on completely different trajectories, or do their arcs have something in common? Because if Mel and Faye just have like, if their arcs are just apples and oranges and they're not really about the same theme, then it'd be hard to create a character who has a foot in both of those arcs.
Well, Mel's. Oh, sorry.
I'm done.
So if Mel's character arc eventually goes to the point where he realizes, he kind of realizes that he doesn't need other people's approval, and he kind of like is able to like lessen on those insecurities that have kind of been driving him to his idea of success. And then Faye's arc is kind of being able to finally kind of like accept someone else's kindness and being able to kind of like trust in one another.
Yeah, I think it's apples and oranges. You're not dealing with two arcs that are in the same, like they're I guess sort of related. It's kind of like an orange and a tangerine maybe, but you're not quite like, they're not, because you have one that's about image and about community and identity, and just mutual respect from your peers, and like who do I need to approve me? It's all image. That's Mel. Mel's all image. And then Faye is all, it's about intimacy and it's about opening up and it's about trust and kindness and accepting kindness. Honestly, I would just decide who Roderick matters more to between those two. Like, is Roderick a supporting character for Mel or is Roderick a supporting character for Faye? Because I don't know if it's possible for him to be a supporting character for both. You might be able to work it out, but man, yeah, it's tough.
Do you think that you could be able to work on or as a supporting character on different levels? Like having someone who is a supporting character on an external level and an internal level for another character?
Well, I mean, think about this. If Mel's arc is all about identity and about like sort of approval, self-worth, that type of thing, how does Roderick factor into that? That's the first question you ask. Like, where does Roderick stand on that theme? What is Roderick's orientation on that specific theme? And then Faye's arc is about intimacy and opening up and trusting. How does Roderick factor into that? Like, what's Roderick's stance on that theme? And can those two perspectives coexist within one character who still has concrete goals and beliefs?
It's tricky, I can say that much.
Because he's just like, he has two hemispheres. And so if Roderick is, what I was going to suggest is that you could just create another character, or use one that you already have, but reorient them a little bit.
Is there anyone you would suggest, or anyone
I
who
mean,
we have?
I mean, Vincent matters to Mel's arc. Think about that. Okay, so what does Mel need to learn? Mel needs to learn that this fake approval from this villain community, this is just coming from insecurity, and it's not real. It's not real. That's not real community. That's not real friendship. So a supporting character for Mel is somebody who has a different perspective on that dilemma, meaning a character who either does think that the villain community is the answer, does rely on that, or a character who has broken free of that, who has who has who sees through the bullshit, you know? And I
Yeah.
think that's kind of Vincent. That's sort of what Vincent is. But also you're making Vincent about success. And I guess the question is like, if you're just saying that success from Mel's perspective is social success, you know, approval, popularity, then for Vincent at least, if you want to say that, okay, Vincent could go one of two ways. Either Vincent betrayed the villains because he found community with the heroes, or Vincent has foregone the need for this fake superficial community thinking altogether. So either Vincent is the other side of the same coin, or Vincent has left the cave. You know, which one is it?
I think with Vincent, I feel like he's less about the community and more in terms of success, because I know he left the community less because, or less to do with like finding community elsewhere, but more because he realized he could be able to become successful if he joined the other side with the information that he had. I think I might want to see if I create or could create like a different character around, or maybe like split Roderick into like two characters somehow. But I think I have a clearer idea of like what Vincent's role is in the story than Roderick's.
Right. And I guess just how does the success thing is kind of a curveball for me, because I don't like, you have to define if that's going to be a major theme and a major point of contention, you know, that they have different definitions of success that's worth fleshing out. Because Mel's definition of success seems to be the approval of his peers. And Vincent's definition of success seems to be actual power and resources and, you know, really winning in life, despite how people think about him, you know, despite how it affects his image. Vincent doesn't care about that. So you have two characters with conflicting ideas of success. But since you're framing Mel's idea of success as a flaw, you know, you're saying, no, that's not how success is. The question is like, are we saying that Vincent has the right idea? Or are we saying Vincent just has a different idea that's not quite the right idea? You know?
Probably also a different idea that isn't quite the right idea. I think in terms of the arc of like where or what Mel considers to be like success, if at the beginning of it, it's kind of like, I want to get into the club, I want to be or gain the approval of these other people. And by the end of that, he realizes that he doesn't need that. Maybe it's like less about the approval of like a giant like community and everything. And maybe more of like an approval of just kind of like one person. Because you got me thinking back to Oranges and Tangerines here, and maybe of how his and Faye's arcs can be a little bit more intertwined by the end of the season.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess then it's hard to see how a close friendship with one person, like you're really stretching it by saying that that is one definition of success. Like it's certainly a good thing, and it's certainly a thing that he could see the value in. But for him to say, "Oh, real success was bonding with my henchmen," like that doesn't. I don't know. Does that
It's
really like?
it's a
That's
pretty
not satisfying. You know, that's not like. I can't see how he would possibly consider that success in remotely the same way as the success that he's been craving. I think a better way to frame it wouldn't be around success, but around um, the validation and approval of his peers, the image, you know? Um, if you just make it about image and you make it about, you know, I care what all these people think about me, then it would be a more satisfying conclusion if at the end of the day he just realized it's like, why do I care what they think? What do you think, Faye? I mean, just like, you know, a relationship that doesn't have any major social implications yet his relationship with Faye is the one that he ultimately decides to hold on to, because he realizes that that's what matters. This is what a real connection is like, not this, image stuff. But then again, Vincent does not have an actual stance on that. Vincent's stance is on the definition of success. And it's not really about image. And so I'm trying to reorient Vincent's perspective to be about image. Either Vincent doesn't care about image, or Vincent, sees through it, or Vincent finds his, sense of validation and image with the superheroes, just anything to tie it into the image arc theme.
Well, certainly as a superhero, he certainly is getting some kind of validation, or he's getting some kind of he has like a very like public image thus far in like being what he is, despite the fact that he isn't like an actual like he isn't actually like saving anyone pretty much. He's become incredibly successful with this kind of like image, but at the end it doesn't really mean anything because he doesn't have any people who actually matter in his life. He is not validated by anyone who he cares about, because all the people that he cared about he pushed away and he betrayed for the sake of holding on to or gaining said image.
By all the people he cared about, you just mean
Mel,
right? Yeah. So, because if you say that Vincent was like, again, we can't imply that there are any real connections in the supervillain community at large, because that would go against the theme too. So, just to say that, yeah, he cared about Mel, but he sacrificed Mel. He sacrificed his relationship with Mel to pursue image. That's one way to do it. And I think the other way to do it is that he broke up with Mel because Mel was so caught up in the image, and Vincent started to see the truth, and that's why Vincent left. Both ways, I think you could do it. But either way,
honestly, that would probably even work better, because I know I'm not sure how far like you are on like episode 3 and such, but there's a point where Vincent and Faye have a conversation, and Faye kind of like Vincent ends up bringing up like Faye. He's like, my friend doesn't really like my choice in career paths, but if I had it his way, I would barely be able to afford rent. And then Faye's like, oh yeah, I also like have a friend like that too. Like I was supposed to be like robbing a bank tonight, and instead I'm here like at this party just for reasons I don't really know why. But I like the idea of Vincent leaving because Mel got too caught up with the image.
right. And so then Vincent is like, again, Vincent has been out of the cave. Vincent sees, it's like, why is that your definition of success? Why are you so hung up on image? And Vincent doesn't have to have the answer. Vincent just has to see Mel's flaw for what it is. And so Vincent can be a terrible person overall, but Vincent can still be like, so why are you so caught up in like, what other people think you? Just do what you want. What do you want? And of course, Mel, that doesn't click for Mel yet. But Vincent, you could say Vincent left initially because Mel cared more about being liked than about their relationship. Imagine this. Imagine if Vincent was just a total loser in the supervillain community, and Mel didn't want to associate with him because he had low status, and Mel was afraid to associate with Vincent because it's like, dude, you're making me look bad. It's like that. It's like, I can't be seen with you. It's bad PR, that type of thing. So maybe it was Mel who initiated the split between them.
For some reason, I imagine it almost going the other way around, of like Vincent is the one who's kind of like sort of like admired by everyone else, and Mel's kind of the one who like comes off as kind of like like the know-it-all and stuff in like college and everything. And like Mel's like loyal to, or Vincent is loyal to Mel up until a point where he realizes that Mel is very, very caught up in this idea of wanting to become this big supervillain, of like really wanting to go that, but he's really on board with the route which he's going. So when he sees an opportunity, yeah. So when he sees an opportunity, he kind of goes and does something, even if it means betraying Mel.
Well, you're contradicting yourself now, because if Vincent no longer wants to associate with Mel because Vincent is Mr. Popular and Mel is a loser, then how could Vincent possibly criticize Mel for being image obsessed? In this sense, they're both image obsessed. Like, you know what I mean? Like
images.
How could, I mean, if Vincent leaves Mel because Mel is seen as a loser, then, I mean, if that's the way you want to take it, the implications are just different, you know? You can't say then that Vincent has been out of the cave. Vincent is still in the cave because he just broke up with this guy purely for image reasons. Or, I mean, the way you describe it is also like, yeah, no, do you see what I mean though? Like that doesn't work.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. I think a lot of it, I think it's definitely some stuff that I still need to keep on looking into and working, or like kind of like reworking and seeing how that stuff kind of like fits and everything. I know at the end of the day, I know Vincent is someone who still is willing to like throw Mel under the bus if it means kind of like maintaining his image. And I think for Vincent, he still cares about Mel to a certain extent, not to the extent where he's willing like not to betray him and everything, but maybe for Roderick, in making Mel his nemesis, he can be able to keep Mel in the picture while also keeping his own like public image. Like he can have it both ways, kind of deal.
I guess that makes sense, but then you have to, I mean, again, you can't make the reason they broke up be Vincent saw that Mel was image obsessed, because they're both image obsessed. You know, they're both playing the same game here. And if that's the point you want to make with them, that's cool. But then you kind of just have to own it. So it can't be, you know, Vincent can't have a point now. Vincent can't be like, oh, where you were just trying to win the approval of these supervillains. I'm like, yeah, they were at the supervillain university. Vincent left him because he was less popular. This is literally, they're in the exact same headspace, just on different ends of it, you know, because Vincent is popular and Mel isn't. Like that to me exempts Vincent from being some kind of, you know, character who has wisdom to grant, because he's just as flawed.
If not more so.
What?
If not more so, because I know when it comes to Vincent,
Yeah.
I'd like him to be a tragic character in the sense that Vincent is someone who can never learn from his mistakes. Where like Mel can.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess they're not like the same character morally, because, you know, you have one of them who achieved the goals in question. You know, you have Vincent who did get the approval he wanted. In this case, then you're fully leaning into the idea that Vincent found approval in the superheroes. Like that's what you're doing. Because Vincent has to still be married to the image thing.
Well,
because if he's like,
he's found approval by the supervillains, but that approval, even with that approval, like for him, he realizes that it's like, oh, I've kind of gotten what I wanted, but I'm not satisfied with it, or I'm not happy.
And so then he sought approval from the heroes, is what you're saying?
So in terms of trying to find or talking about like getting like validation, if he now has like what Mel wants, or if he kind of threw Mel under the bus to kind of get success, to have this image as a superhero, he now has that image, but he isn't happy with it. Or like personally, he does not feel happy about where he is. And so he's kind of gained the thing that he wanted, but he isn't satisfied with it. And
Okay.
maybe to an extent that could like foreshadow kind of Mel's flaw, the sense that he wants validation from the supervillains, but if he gets that, is he necessarily going to be happy?
So what does Vincent think Vincent wants?
Vincent thinks that he wants to kind of be loved by everyone, that he wants to be like successful and rich and have like this big giant image, which he has now gained through betraying the supervillains.
So he can't not like it. Like if he achieved everything he wanted, but it's not enough, then what can he possibly want at this point? You know what I mean? Like
I think
you introduce him in the story and he's already achieved everything he's ever wanted. If that's the case, then he can't, then he by definition is a more learned character. He has more to say to Mel, right? Like he has more advice to lend. If he's achieved everything that Mel wants and it's still not enough, then I find it hard to believe that he would still be, that you're saying that he's unable to change. Like that doesn't sound like the type of character who would do this. I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's the sense of like when we first meet him, he has everything that he wants. I think he has everything that he thought he wanted, rather than that be what he wants. Like if
Okay, so yeah.
yeah.
So how does he feel about that? Like, what does he? If he's just talking to Mel about that, he's like, "Well, I have everything that I ever wanted, and how do I feel about it? Go." How does he feel?
Probably empty, or like probably like in terms of like not like dropping down kind of like the persona, he probably feels like pretty empty and kind of sad and frustrated because he doesn't know why.
Okay, that's solid. That's something you can work with. Um, does he have then what exactly would he argue with Mel? Is he telling Mel, if you achieve this, you'll feel empty like me? Is that what he's telling Mel?
I don't think I'm trying to think if he would be telling Mel anything, because he wants to keep Mel in his life because Mel is kind of the only thing that he has that isn't part of this kind of like image that he's gained. Um he's betrayed this person in order to get this image, but he doesn't want to lose that person.
Yeah, but I mean, how does he feel about Mel's perspective? Like if Mel said, "I'm going to become the greatest supervillain ever and everybody will love me," how does Vincent respond to that statement?
It's not always great to have everyone love you, I guess.
Yeah, okay. So then
That's not as fulfilling as you might think.
yes, that right. Okay, that makes sense. Um, but then obviously Mel has to shrug that off because Mel doesn't believe that yet. Mel still believes that he needs the approval of everybody, you know?
Yeah.
And Vincent is trying to return to his only real connection. Maybe instead of trying to help Mel, Vincent goes along with Mel because he just wants to be with Mel, you know? So Mel's like, look, if you want to, you know, if you want to still have me in your life, this is what we're doing. This is the goal, and you're either with me or against me. And maybe Vincent says, all right, I'm with you. And Vincent shuts up, and Vincent doesn't challenge that perspective anymore because he knows if he does challenge the perspective, then Mel's going to push him away, you know?
I like the idea and concept, but I feel like I already have an idea of where I want the two characters to kind of be in terms of their relationship. I think for Vincent, he's a character who kind of wants to have it both ways. He still wants to be successful while simultaneously having Mel in his life. And Mel's at a point where he isn't comfortable with having Vincent in his life because Vincent has yet to acknowledge what and kind of like take like the consequences for what he has done.
But Vincent doesn't want to have it both ways because he achieved everything he wanted and it's not satisfying, which is why he's returning to Mel. He's had a character change, right? He doesn't get anything out of fame anymore. It's not enough. That's what we're saying. So that's the reason he's returning to Mel, is because he has seen the phoniness of these fake connections and is now deciding, I want to go back to the real connection that I have. Right? That's his goal at this point in the story. That's what we're saying.
I think I think with Vincent it comes across as less about like he's realized everyone's like a phony and he's kind of like ready to go back to Mel, and it's more so he's kind of realized everything is like everything is phony, but he isn't willing to admit to himself that he's unhappy. Like he's like trying to convince himself that this is the life he wants.
So then why does he return to Mel?
I think he just can't help it. I think that Mel is the one authentic thing that he still has, and he keeps on going back to Mel because at a certain point you can only kind of like wear a facade for so long before you finally like just need someone else or someone who is able to finally get on your level, I guess.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, he has the same thinking, but it's just some of it is subconscious, is what we're saying here. Like he's not admitting it. Sure, fine, but that also, again, he's fundamentally not getting what he wants out of the fame thing. And because of that, he is returning to Mel. Whether it's conscious or subconscious, that is what's happening.
Yeah.
So what do they talk about? What knowledge does he impart? Like, is he a good influence on Mel or a bad influence?
Probably a bad influence.
Why?
I assume probably just because of the ways that he has hurt Mel and the way that he's kind of like prioritized putting himself over his friend.
But now he's not doing that. Now he's making time for Mel. Like I see that like he definitely made mistakes in the past, but he's coming back because he got everything he wanted and it wasn't enough.
Well, that, but
So,
he's also not acknowledging the fact that he did something wrong, and he doesn't
yes.
want he doesn't want to have to deal with the consequences of his actions by like acknowledging kind of like the elephant in the room. He wants to try to see if he can have it like both ways. God, I keep on repeating that so much. But at the same time, like he wants to like keep this image because that's everything that he's done all of this for. And so if it's not worth it, like it can't not be worth it because of everything that he's kind of like sacrificed and such, or everything that he's done to get to this point. But he also doesn't want to kind of lose Mel. And Mel is just kind of, he's trying to work up, trying to say like, hey, I don't want this anymore. Like when in the scene where the two of them are like together post like flashback and such, like Vincent clearly doesn't respect Mel's boundaries of wanting him to be like, hey, listen, this is nice, but I feel like like there also should be like kind of like boundaries between us and our relationship, because in not establishing boundaries, we're not acknowledging the fact that you ultimately screwed me over.
Okay, I guess all of that makes sense, but thematically, I'm returning to the question of how exactly does Vincent feel about Mel's goals? Does he approve? Does he disapprove? Does he understand? Where does Vincent stand on Mel's goals?
I'd say he would disapprove because he's gotten at this point everything that Mel believes he wants at this point in time, and he's not satisfied with it.
That would make it conscious.
There's no way I can make it unconscious, I presume.
Well, I mean, you said that you wanted to make it unconscious because you still wanted Vincent to be attached to his fame on some level. You
Yes.
still wanted Vincent. So why does Vincent disapprove of Mel's goals? Why does Mel says, I want to be the best superhero ever. I want to be the shit. How does Vincent respond to that? And why does he respond that way? And that why has to connect to his own life. And we're talking like, if this was an actual verbal conversation,
I think
which
Vincent
means you have to take conscious versus unconscious into account here, because you can't say something that's unconscious. You say something that, whatever's in the forefront of your head, that's what's coming out through your actual words. And there might be a deeper motivation, there might not. But yeah. How do you feel about that?
I'd say in terms of like a conversation, if like before like Mel's saying like, oh yeah, I want to be like the biggest supervillain and stuff, I think Vincent might like roll his eyes just because I think you're right when you say that he could be able to like kind of bring some wisdom to the table. In terms of like goals, he's already like achieved everything that Mel essentially wants, and he's not entirely happy with it. And he's not willing to like acknowledge that, but I don't think that would make it impossible from him to not kind of like see like a bit of naivete in the way that Mel is looking at what he wants.
So Mel says, I want to be the goodest superhero, a villain ever, and I want to be the best. I want everybody to respect me. And then Vincent says, well, I mean, it's not all that. It's, and then Mel goes, but you yourself are so attached to this persona and you're all famous and stuff. You're saying you don't like it? And Vincent says, well,
We're talking about you. We're not talking about me. You and I are
so
completely different scenarios. And Vincent would be saying this in terms of just like denial or in terms of just not wanting to acknowledge the
yet,
fact.
for some reason, Vincent is willingly imparting wisdom onto Mel, consciously, willingly imparting wisdom onto Mel. So why is he doing that if he's been lying to himself about the same topic the whole time? Like, you can only use, oh, people are complicated as a loophole for so long. At some point, like, what does Vincent believe specifically? He believes that, I don't know. It's not quite working for me.
You yourself, or you as talking from Vincent's perspective?
No, me myself. There seems to be a missing link here. Or, I mean, I know you already have a very clear idea of how you want the relationship to be, but I would be open to changing that if I were you, just because
I
it
think
might ultimately not serve
the
Mel's
thing
character as well as you think it is, or at least, as well as it might seem on paper. Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, something that I might to do, or something that I'm probably going to need to do in terms of just like what I'll be thinking about for like the rest of the summer, and as I keep on revising these scripts and writing more, is definitely looking at a little bit more at like the themes and such, and like how that kind of translates through the characters, their actions, motivations, and even just like the constructs within the world itself. Because I feel
Yeah.
like from the idea of what I thought at the very beginning of just being really or surrounded by like relationships and success, the idea of success or the idea of that has kind of now it's kind of changed like pretty significantly to the point where I'll need to kind of like reevaluate some more kind of aspects in this story.
Right. And that makes sense. I think that was definitely the thing that was stopping it from being totally cohesive, was just defining specifically what themes you're tackling here. And yeah, I
So
mean, that's not stuff that's going to happen overnight. That's going to take a lot of contemplation.
it's good. It's good though to kind of like have a sense, because I feel like that was probably my biggest blind spot in this project thus far, because I have a very solid idea of the characters, but it's how they tie into the themes that things get a little bit more muddled.
Right. And character in and of itself is like, it can be perfectly like entertaining and compelling. But then when it comes time to have actual plot payoffs, that's when you run into problems where you're like, oh, well, I guess like, this character doing this thing does, like it does solve a plot problem, but how does it, what does it mean to them emotionally, or the other way around? It's just like theme is kind of what binds, I think, characters to each other and what binds them to the plot, because they have goals, which means they have agency, which means they make decisions based on what they want. And yeah, I guess just in this case, it felt a little loose. And I'm glad we pinned down sort of the source of that looseness, even if we didn't quite resolve it.
And like I'm glad it's still somewhat unresolved, because then it gives me just a lot more time to just think about how things are going to be moving forward.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of potential here, especially in sort of taking the villain identity complex that you see in like other pieces of media and actually like deconstructing and figure out, okay, so why are people like this? What's really going on in all
What is
this
motivating all of these people?
yeah, this theatricality? What is it really? What's especially what's binding them together to each other? The sense of community. I think that's really cool stuff. I'm going to end the recording here.
Alrighty.
Um